The purpose of my talk is not to provide an exhaustive account on the internal situation in Zimbabwe that led to the resignation of Robert Mugabe. Hopefully everyone has read or will read Comrade Abayomi Azikiwe's excellent front page article that provides important background information. And it's still a very, very fluid situation in Zimbabwe. So there's no way you can have a definitive analysis of what's going on internally there. So a lot of the information we have to depend on, bourgeois accounts, along with, accounts from, especially from black, information. Abayumi's article also raises important key points for the ongoing struggle for sovereignty for Zimbabwe in the midst of imperialist intervention. And I just want to mention that on February 3rd, which is a Saturday, we're planning a special forum. In fact, hopefully we'll launch a number of forums for Black History Month on Zimbabwe, where we have invited December 12th movement to come and speak. And they're going to let us know for sure later on in December. But and it's very important to hear what they have to say, because they have had for many years, interactions, with the government of Zimbabwe. They have traveled to Zimbabwe, and they've held numerous U.S. hands or U.S. British hands off of Zimbabwe events in Harlem and in Brooklyn. So we really look forward to, having them share their information and analysis on this situation. Now, there's no doubt that the resignation of Mugabe is not only changing the social landscape for the people of Zimbabwe, but for all of Africa. For many of us, Marxists and revolutionaries are duty-bound to analyze these developments from a materialist, anti-imperialist perspective in order to strategize to deepen our solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Zimbabwe against ongoing imperialist machinations. With this resignation, this development is still very, very much part and parcel of the ongoing struggle for independence and sovereignty against imperialism. Walter Rodney, the martyred Guyanese leader who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa in 1972, brilliantly applies a Marxist materialist worldview towards Africa. And I think we're ordering some of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, along with Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, and also Nkrumah's wonderful pamphlet, Class Struggle in Africa, which I'll be quoting from. It's very important for us to study these Marxist leaders from the developing world. Rodney opens up the first chapter of his book on, quote, what is development and what is underdevelopment. And he opens up this chapter with a quote from Che Guevara back in 1994, and I think it's worth reading here. And this is a quote: in contrast with the surging growth of the countries in our socialist camp and the development taking place, albeit much more slowly, in the majority of the capitalist countries, is the unquestionable fact that a large proportion of the so-called underdeveloped countries are in total stagnation, and that in some of them, the rate of economic growth is lower than that of population increase. These characteristics are not fortuitous. They correspond strictly to the nature of the capitalist system in full expansion, which transfers to the dependent countries the most abusive and barefaced forms of exploitation. It must be clearly understood that the only way to solve the questions now besetting humankind is to eliminate completely the exploitation of dependent countries by developed capitalist countries with all the consequences that this implies, end quote. In applying this quote specifically to Africa, Rodney states in another quote, An even more indispensable component of modern underdevelopment is that it expresses a particular relationship of exploitation, the exploitation of one country by another. All of the countries named as, quote, underdevelopment in the world are exploited by others. And the underdevelopment with which the world is now preoccupied is a product of capitalist, imperialist, and colonialist exploitation. African and Asian societies were developing independently until they were taken over directly or indirectly by the capitalist powers. When that happened, exploitation increased and the export of surplus ensued, depriving the societies of the benefit of their natural resources and labor. That is an integral part of underdevelopment in the contemporary sense, end quote. This describes, I think really in a very succinct way, the situation for Zimbabwe and the rest of the African continent that suffers many degrees of underdevelopment. It was the Berlin Conference in 1885, or the, quote, Scramble for Africa, end quote, conference, where the European capitalist countries met to carve up virtually the entire African continent in order to expand their markets for profits by super-exploiting African labor and plundering the super-rich mineral resources. And the transatlantic slave trade that resulted in tens of millions of African peoples being stolen from their homeland laid the foundation for colonialism and neo-colonialism. In the case of Zimbabwe, it was Cecil Rhodes who became the British colonizer of then Rhodesia in the late 1800s. Rhodes was known for establishing the De Beers Mining Company, known for its stolen diamonds from Zimbabwe, as he treated the entire country as his private slave plantation with the backing of the most brutal state brutality. Walter Rodney dedicates a large chapter to the advanced cultural achievements of various African countries before slavery, before colonialism and neo-colonialism. This is just one small part of what he stated about Zimbabwe in its earlier stages of development. Quote, when Cecil Rhodes sent in his agents to rob and steal in Zimbabwe, they and other Europeans marveled at the surviving ruins of the Zimbabwe culture and automatically assumed that it had been built by white people. Even today, there is still a tendency to consider the achievements with a sense of wonder rather than with the calm acceptance that it was a perfectly logical outgrowth of human social development within Africa, as part of the universal process by which, he uses the word man's, labor opened up new horizons. The sense of reality can only be restored by making it clear that the architecture rested on a foundation of advanced agriculture and mining, which had come into existence over centuries of evolution, end quote. Now, by 1914, white settlers, numbering just a little over 23,000, owned slightly more than 19 million acres of land in then Rhodesia, while an estimated 272,000 Africans occupied a little over 21 million acres of land. And by 1930, in Zimbabwe, the European areas numbered over 49 million acres. That's more than 51%. And the so-called native reserves, which is really, for the indigenous population, it was a little over 21 million acres, which was only 22% of the overall lands in Zimbabwe. Eventually, thousands of armed colonizers, under the guise of being white farmers, carried out a systematic violent campaign of wars and maneuvers to uproot the indigenous African population from their lands. This is despite many heroic resistance campaigns carried out by the African population who could not match the firepower of the colonizers. Ian Smith, who was proclaimed as Prime Minister of Rhodesia in 1964, and in the process confiscated over 6,000 acres of land just for himself and his family. His apartheid policies codified these farmers' use of the land for commercial farming, for like tobacco, corn, etc., to be sold as commodities on the world capitalist market. So while these farmers were enriching themselves, the people of Zimbabwe faced starvation and were reduced to being so-called tenants on their own lands. The white farmers were in reality plantation owners, and the indigenous population comparable to slaves without the chains. Carrying forth the legacy of the first two phases of the liberation struggle, the third, Chimaranga, which means liberation struggle, created two fronts that arose in the late 1960s. One was ZANU, which was the Zimbabwe African National Union, that was led by Robert Mugabe. And the other was the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which was led by Joshua Nkomo. These two guerrilla factions joined forces as the Patriotic Front to force the Ian Smith government to a negotiating table in Britain to sign the Lancaster House Accords, which was a compromise that supposedly held the British government accountable for financially compensating white farmers so that black farmers could reclaim their lands. A large sector of those who fought for the liberation of Zimbabwe were landless black farmers, now commonly referred to as war veterans, who participate, of course, in the liberation struggle. Now, 20 years later, these same war veterans pressured the Mugabe government to remove the commercial farmers, even though this was supposed to happen, you know, in the early 1980s. It really didn't, because the British government kept stalling and stalling and stalling. But anyway, these veterans forced the Mugabe government to remove the commercial farmers, to live up to this agreement by force if necessary. Once the British government reneged on its Lancaster House Agreement, Mugabe then established a radical land redistribution program, giving the green light to war veterans to take back their stolen lands, including by force. And this included Ian Smith's lands as well. Then Prime Minister Tony Blair and President Bush imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe starting in 2002 as an act of war against the population by slashing fuel and food subsidies with the aim of hoping to turn the masses against Mugabe by making him the scapegoat for any economic hardships imposed really by imperialism. When Mugabe was re-elected as president during his 37 years, both in office, both Blair and Bush would declare the elections, quote unquote, undemocratic, while attempting to prop up their own puppet candidates, especially from the Movement for Democratic Change, or the MDC. Even when a devastating drought hit Zimbabwe and other parts of southern Africa very hard in 2003, the imperialists blamed Mugabe for it. How you blame a person for, you know, a drought? But anyway, but also we have to recognize actually the Zimbabwe's largest workers' union, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, says that the country's unemployment rate is now 90%, because you know this is a mainly agriculture population, mainly a peasantry, you know, population with very, very little industry even today, and a lot of the industry is based on, you know, small vendors, you know, trying to sell their crops, against a huge capitalist, market, which is very, very difficult. So today, Zimbabwe's foreign debt stands at more than $7 billion, more than half of its gross domestic product. According to a July 7th Reuters report, and this is a quote, the suggested reforms from the banks, like IMF, World Bank, and so forth, they include slashing public sector wages, now at more than 90% of the national budget, reducing farm subsidies, improving transparency in the mining sector, and reaching an agreement on the compensation of white farmers, end quote. So once again, the Zimbabwe economy is supposed to bear the responsibility of compensating white farmers. And this $7 billion debt comes after Zimbabwe claimed a default in 1999 on its debt. So it's important to be clear, really, comrades and friends, why the U.S. and British imperialism have hated Mugabe since he became the first democratically elected president, and why they're so glad that he was forced to resign. Was it because he was a socialist like Fidel? No, far from it. Mugabe is a bourgeois nationalist, similar to other African leaders. We don't agree with all the policies, that have come from Mugabe. But there are really two fundamental reasons why the imperialists hate him so much. One is that he was a leader of a guerrilla movement. That's the first part. That's the first reason. A leader of a national liberation movement that helped to bring an end to the racist apartheid regime led by Ian Smith in 1990. But even more importantly than that is that he backed the war veterans taking back their land from the white colonizers, and he was unapologetic about it. In fact, he wrote a letter after his resignation that just came out today on the Black Left Unity listserv, where he said, just remember what I did. Remember what I tried to make sure that that Zimbabwe was on the road to independence, and everything I tried to do to make that happen. So with all of his political contradictions, Mugabe was willing to stand up against U.S. and British imperialism. Mugabe let the world know that he will not bow down to imperialist threats and schemes without a struggle. But he's 93 years old also. So, comrades and friends, it is this defiance against imperialism that seeks to break all bonds of international proletarian solidarity, especially with the most oppressed, that our party has done everything that it can to defend Zimbabwe, which means defending its leadership against imperialist intervention, both economically and politically. Because like any other country, all Zimbabwe has sought to do since its independence in 1980 is to develop its economic infrastructure to meet the needs of the people, not to have its economy be chained to a foreign debt to the banks that it can never pay back in 10 lifetimes. With all the millions of acres of arable lands, the Zimbabwean people have the capacity to feed its population if they were not forced to export food to pay off the interest alone on their foreign debt. So we say cancel this criminal debt. No matter what happens in Zimbabwe going forth, and we know that U.S. and British imperialism will not stop their intervention into the internal affairs of Zimbabwe. They have made that abundantly clear in saying that, quote, fair and democratic elections have to take place when they say so, not when the people of Zimbabwe say so. And now the biggest threat to the African continent today is the U.S. Africa Command. more commonly known as AFRICOM, created by the Pentagon under the guise of fighting so-called terrorism. AFRICOM is based in at least 38 African countries, with some of those countries having multiple bases. 3 of these bases are in Zambia, South Africa, and Botswana that border Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe doesn't have a base, AFRICOM base, but you see the 3 countries that do, that surround it. AFRICOM does not exist to protect the sovereignty of the African peoples, but to protect the interest of the monopolies by repressing any kind of mass resistance to its brutal occupation, no matter what the ideology of the leadership is to that resistance. AFRICOM's direct intervention into Africa includes Zimbabwe's internal affairs, and we have to continue to be vigilant and to oppose this intervention in the streets. So in closing, I want to end my remarks with an extended quote from Kwame Nkrumah, the first democratically elected president of another British colony, Ghana. And this is from his class struggle in Africa. And up until his death in 1972, Nkrumah advocated for a united socialist Africa. And I want to read several paragraphs where he speaks so eloquently on what makes up a nation when it comes to people of African descent, which relates to what is going on in Zimbabwe. The African revolutionary struggle is not an isolated one. It not only forms part of the world socialist revolution, but must be seen in the context of the Black revolution as a whole. In the U.S., the Caribbean, and wherever Africans are oppressed, liberation struggles are being fought. In these areas, the Black man or Black person is in a condition of domestic colonialism and suffers both on the grounds of class and of color. The core of the Black revolution is in Africa, and until Africa is united under a socialist government, the Black people throughout the world lack a national home. It is around the African people's struggles for liberation and unification that African or Black culture will take shape and substance. Africa is one continent, one people, and one nation. The notion that in order to have a nation, it is necessary for there to be a common language, a common territory, and a common culture has failed to stand the test of time or the scrutiny of scientific definition of objective reality. Common territory, language, and culture may in fact be present in a nation, but the existence of a nation does not necessarily imply the presence of all 3. Common territory and language alone may form the basis of a nation. Similarly, common territory plus common culture may be the basis. In some cases, only one of the 3 applies. A state may exist on a multinational basis. The community of economic life is the major feature within a nation, and it is the economy that holds together the people living in a territory. It is on this basis that the new Africans recognize themselves as potentially one nation, whose dominion is the entire African continent. The total liberation and unification of Africa under an all-African socialist government must be the primary objective of all Black revolutionaries throughout the world. It is an objective which, when achieved, will bring about the fulfillment of the aspirations of Africans and people of African descent everywhere. It will be at the same time advance the triumph of the international socialist revolution and the onward progress towards world communism, under which every society is ordered on the principle of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. AFRICOM out of Africa, hands off Zimbabwe, reparations for the people of African descent now. Thank you. When Teresa raised about the commemoration regarding Fidel's the first anniversary of his death, I sort of went to the internet, especially knowing that D12 was there, and I wanted to read this because let's see. When Fidel died, Robert Mugabe went to his funeral. And this is what he said when he got off the plane at Jose Marti. He said, "Fidel Castro was not just your leader. He was our leader, and the leader of all revolutionaries. We followed him, listened to him, and tried to emulate him." Describing Castro's death as a great loss to Cuba, Mugabe said the leader of the Cuban Revolution was being mourned in all communities in Africa, where, he claimed, his liberation ideology perpetuates. So that's very, very important. And just to sort of piggyback on what Larry said about the influence of really the African revolutionary struggles, especially right here for myself and Larry and others, you know. That's what made us political. A lot of us became political because of what was going on in Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique, you know, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia. And we have to always remember, comrades, yes, there was contradictions within ZANU, you know, PF government. There's contradictions in terms of the South African ANC-led government as well. You know, and that's something else that at some point we'll have to discuss, because to answer Tedes's question about the forced migration, if there's any forced migration from Zimbabwe, it's in South Africa. A lot of the people who feel like they're forced to leave Zimbabwe are going into South Africa. It's right next door. They have a large land issue too, even though it's more industrialized than Zimbabwe. But you know, what needs to be said is that while there's these guerrilla struggles that happen in Zimbabwe, that happen in South Africa, you know, led by Nkuntewe Siswe, which was tied to ANC. That was the arm wing of the South African struggle. They were not able to complete their revolutions. They were not. They were forced to compromise. Whether it's in Zimbabwe with this Lancaster House agreement, they weren't able to carry this. They had to compromise with the British colonialists around the issue of land, and that's still going on today. That has not been completed. That process of giving all the land back to the war veterans. Because right now the British and U.S., you know, they still, you know, dominate the Zimbabwean economy. You know, with the sanctions and, of course, the foreign debt and IMF and World Bank. There's no independence there. And the same thing for South Africa, too. As industrialized as it is, as powerful as these unions like COSATU and the other unions that related to COSATU, the economies are still dominated by world imperialism. And even that's caused some friction between the Zimbabwean, you know, government under Mugabe and the South African government as well. I mean, Mugabe has been known to make anti-Mandela statements saying that, well, Mandela, you know, gave the land back, you know, to the white settlers. Now, I mean, you know, this is sort of, you know, this has been documented. So it's been friction even between these two governments. So to the point that the South African Communist Party actually put out a statement saying that they welcomed the resignation of Mugabe. But they also talked about the underlying problems that are still facing Zimbabwe. You know, the role of U.S. and British imperialism, that these problems weren't caused by one leader alone, but by, you know, imperialism. So I think and to answer the other question, was that John? Did you ask? Are you John? Okay. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the new leader that's taken over, you know, again, it raises the whole issue of how do you carry forth the revolutionary process in Zimbabwe? And it's got to be the masses. The masses are going to have to, and I'm sure they will, they're going to regroup and intervene, and they have to take on what's going on internally. No one else should be interfering from the outside with the affairs of the Zimbabwean, you know, people. So how are the masses going to intervene? That's going to be very, very critical, because this issue of the land is still a big question, notwithstanding, all the other issues that they're facing in terms of the lack of, as Larry was saying, the lack of development and infrastructure. And China is playing, I'll end with this, China is playing a major role in Zimbabwe. I hope Gary Wilson shares this very important article that he sent me about assessing the China factor in Kenya and Zimbabwe. And there is and that's probably why the anti-China stuff is coming out, because China is trying to assist, the Zimbabwean people with building up their infrastructure, big time. It is going on, more so in Zimbabwe than in Kenya, according to this article. So that's something else we have to, you know how the U.S. loves to bash China, along with other world imperialist governments. So anyway, this is to be continued. But we always have to remember, again, these, whether it's by assassination, whether it's by undermining struggles and so revolutionary struggles, compromises and so forth. This is the big issue. How thoroughgoing can these revolutionary, struggles go forth? How can they be completed? And they really can't be completed until we have a revolution here. I mean, we have to have a revolution in the belly of the beast. That's what's going to help, move forward the struggle for, or the issue of, development, full development, and cooperation, revolutionary cooperation, socialist cooperation, especially in Africa and other parts of the developed world. So, anyway, I think that's all I want to say. The U.S. out of Africa. Reparations.